Good morning. On behalf of the Peninsula Foundation, let me welcome you all to our first online panel discussion come video conference event. Today's topic is an extremely interesting one. We are looking at the post COVID 19 world in terms of economic and geopolitical consequences for India and the world. We have two eminent panelists with us, Sri Mohan Gurusamy and Vidya Nadkarni. Mohan Gurusamy is extremely well known across the world and he is a prolific commentator on economics and politics. He's also been a former Rajya Sabha member and former advisor to the finance minister in the Vajpayee government. Mohan is well known across the world and he's an alumni of both Harvard and Stanford. Vidya is the professor of international relations and political science in the University of San Diego, California. She specializes in studying geopolitics and international relations of Russia, China, and India, and of course the geopolitical tangle that goes on in the Eurasian politics. It's a great honor to have Vidya with us, and I look forward to both the panelists' expert comments and a lively interaction with the audience. We also have a very good spectrum of audience, and I welcome all of you. And I look forward to a very lively interaction in the subject today. The format that we are going to follow is we'll first cover in about 2 or 3 minutes, or maybe 4 minutes, the topic of the day. Then I'll invite the panelists to take on and give their views, and each one can take about 20 to 25 minutes, followed by which we will open out for question answer session. I invite the audience to put their questions earlier in the chat format so that I can actually look at that and then select the questions or put the questions in order to the panelists. And of course, we'll also open out for audio interaction with amongst the audience. Let's come to the topic before I hand over to the panelists. The topic is extremely relevant. We are in a crisis as never before. It's a global crisis and a pandemic that's cut across the borders. It has no national relevance, and it's a huge disruptive factor economically, socially, and politically. A similar disruption occurred nearly 100 years ago on account of Spanish flu in 1918-1920 time frame, and by various accounts, the world lost nearly 50 to 100 million people. India was the worst affected. India lost nearly 17.5 million people, and when you compare the two pandemics time frames, a lot of differences compared to today's medical research, medical environment, and health infrastructure that's available across the world. The 1820 time frame is relatively primitive. But there are also few common factors, and that's on account of globalization. The 1820 pandemic was spread across by the returning forces at the end of the First World War. The forces moved across the world from Western Europe to the US to India to Southeast Asia to Australia to New Zealand to Latin America, all across the world. And that spread quite rapidly. Within 6 months, the entire world was covered in that time frame. And that's a kind of a globalization process as well. What happens today is that the globalization has accelerated the spread of the pandemic. We live in a world which is integrated and globalized as never before. People move constantly on account of education, on account of business, on account of travel, on account of tourism, on account of many other factors. Migration, one of the most important factors as well. And therefore, the spread of the virus gets enhanced and accelerated. So if in the past, there were larger time frames between pandemics, in the future, it's likely to be much, much lesser because of the integrated world. And that brings in its own challenges on how nations have to deal with it within their country and internationally. International cooperation then becomes vital in all this. So let's come to the challenges, particularly for a country like India. Each countries across the world are working out on stimulus packages because the economic downturn is huge in the lockdown. And to address that economic lockdown, each one is looking at various solutions, fiscal and monetary. For India, it's huge. India and China have been the engines of global growth for the last 20 years, 30 years. What happens to that? China seems to have handled well, and they are ramping up their economic, engine all over again. But for India, we seem to have a huge disruption. With factors that work against us are a population. 40% of population are nearly below the poverty line. There are nearly our labor force, very large segment, 80% plus work in the informal sector that amounts to 120 million people. And you see the crisis of the migrant laborers who've been impacted by the lockdown. How will the growth be revived in the Indian sector? We need to analyze the stimulus package in those terms. Let's come to the geopolitical factors. Each of these pandemics or each of these disruptions create a hinge moment in history. So the two world wars was a disruption in a continuous factor, but just as E.H. Carr calls it, a 20-year interregnum, and led to the change in the international order, a new world in 1945. That post-1945 world order has continued to last till today, although it becomes a little anachronistic, and many have pointed that out. This pandemic probably will undo that world order. Is the post-1945 world order coming to an end? Is a big question that we raise. And what happens to the new world order? Who's going to dominate that? The battle between US and China for dominance is already evident. But how will the world change? How will the financial structure change? How will the economic integration between countries change? And we are going to be looking at all this. And let me not take any more time on this issue. And I will invite the panelists to come and take the floor. Let me first invite Mohan to come and take the floor.
US and whatever happened in Europe has influenced us so much, because as we were having in the pre-start conversation, the mortality rates and fatality rates in India have been extremely low, and because we have a different demographic profile. But nevertheless, the hit has been taken. As a result, the consumption in the Indian economic component, which is about 65% of GDP, at any given time, has completely collapsed since March, April, and May, and now it's going to be low in June also. And to get back to old levels is going to take a long time, because we've been hit by huge unemployment. After March 21st, the total job losses have been to the order of 131 million. This has been estimated by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, because our economy employment structure is very different. Out of the 480 million or so workforce, 410 are in the unorganized sector. Out of that unorganized sector, 210 are daily wage earners. These people who have to work every day to survive and to feed their families. Now, this is unique to India. It's not, we don't have this situation anywhere else in the world. Even in China, which has a large number of migrant workers, you have the iron rule. So once you are in the system, once you come to work, your employer will feed you. But it is not so in India. The informal arrangements of employment doesn't even involve giving receipts to workers. You're always late on wage payments, because otherwise you might have absenteeism. So the result is everybody is by a month or so. So you have this huge loss in consumption. And that consumption effect, you can see that there's tomatoes rotting in the fields, tomatoes rotting in mandis, vegetables, fruits, prices are completely collapsed. So, that is, and agriculture, though it's only 16% of GDP, employs 60% of our workforce. So direct farm labor employment has also fallen. So we had a complete destruction of bottom of our economy is gone completely. It doesn't exist. People are down to subsistence. The only reason why people are able to survive is that we have enough food stocks, though the distribution is very poor, and we have the joint family system where families, the brotherly is still strong, and you rally around each other. So you go back to a village, it's unlikely that you will starve to death. But there might be a stage when food may not reach and you'll have overall starvation. But that has not come upon us as yet because media connections are strong and information feedback goes back to the government pretty fast. Unlike the Bengal famines where, it took 3 months for Calcutta to realize that people were dying. Now, having said that, what happens is that if you have job losses, and some of the job losses are huge. For instance, construction is completely stopped. Construction adds 7% to GDP. And construction is completely stopped, and that employs 54 million people. The automobile sector, which is 7.5% of GDP, has not had any output for the last 3 months. No sales either. So, the huge sectors of the economy have just disappeared. So I've been doing the numbers again and again, and I can't see how the contraction of the GDP will be less than 10%. The government then has been trying to put out the notion that, we will still do 1.2% growth, but not going to happen. The collapse is here, the contraction is here, and I think we should be ready for that. That is what worries me, is that if you deny what is going to happen, if you deny what is happening, then you don't have solutions. So this is where I come back to the stimulus package. Now, when you have a stimulus package in a collapse like this, you have to get external money to the economy. So there are two ways of getting external money. Is either you borrow from abroad or you create money. And many countries just create money. The US is, for instance, creating $3.5 trillion additional money. They're just printing it. The British are adding 10% to their GDP. The Japanese are adding 20% to their GDP of the GDP by just getting in more money into the system. And they're printing it. It's not that they've hawked their gold to get money. It's just that they're going to print more. Now, we have not done that. What we've got is a retinkering. The only new money into the system is 63,000 crores. And that is not going to do anything for us. Because the stimulus package has gone, in terms of, that too is not direct money, it's, postponement of interest, postponement of installments and stuff like that, which means that you still have to pay. Even TDS deduction, they've given you a 2% concession, but you still have to pay taxes anyway at the end of the year. It's not a reduction in taxes. So this juggling, moving around numbers here and there without actually putting in more money is going to cost us very dearly. I don't think they've realized it in Delhi because then, there are systemic flaws in our system because having been in government, I've seen, how everybody waits for a cue from the top. Even in economic planning, and if you don't have a structure which encourages discussion, as our system doesn't encourage, and free exchange of views, and then you have too many generalists on top. And the guys who make the decisions are not even generalists. There are very few specialists in the loop. For instance, on this pandemic, the people advising government, ICMR chief, AIMS chief, the professionals are cardiologists. You didn't have an epidemiologist in that group. And the epidemiologists are telling you a complete different story, which nobody is listening. They're all talking about herd immunity and allowing it to run out, of course, like Jayaprakash Mulial in Chennai has been saying again and again. And so also have others, Dr. Kang at National Institute of Health and Allergy in Faridabad has been saying that. But it's the voice of the cardiologists and the voice of the generalists in the civil service, the IAS guys, all these chaps who are making policy, who don't understand the view, catering to a panic, and we've created a situation of panic. And quite a lot of it, I think, is excessive. Because at the end of the day, this virus also has to spread and then pass off till we get a vaccine or till we get a medical antidote for it. We don't have either. And either of them will take 18 to 20 months, earliest possible. Ebola virus vaccine has been in the works for 27 years now. It's not so easy. You're not going to get a vaccine in 3 months, 6 months. It's not going to happen. It's going to take time. So I think we have to be preparing for the long haul. We have to, first priority, if I had to advise government today, is to put people back to work and put money in their pockets. We have 72% of the rural population has Jan Dhan accounts. We have only given them 500 rupees a month for 3 months. Where does 500 rupees take you? And you're talking about almost 200 to 50 million people who need these wages. State governments are doing a little more in different states. That depends on the situation of the states. Telangana, for instance, is giving a little more money. But most state governments don't have money because their revenues have collapsed. GST dues are not coming from Delhi, and their own ability to borrow has come down. So we need a great big stimulus package here, which is not coming. And there's no sign of that at all. There's no reaction to any demands for that. The Prime Minister said, I'm giving you a 20 lakh package. They're like all other packages. Bihar got 2 lakh crore package. Kashmir got 1.5 lakh crore packages. But these packages don't amount to anything because they're tinkering with existing budgets and existing figures. For this, you need new money, and that is not coming. Now, out of a GDP of 220 lakh crores, thereabouts, we need at least, Arvind Subramaniam has said it, Raghuram Rajan has not asked for that much money, but others have said that we need that kind of money. Dr. Manmohan Singh has said that you need that kind of money. You need at least 10 lakh crores coming in, new money. And there's no question that there is money around if you shake the trees. For instance, we've got $490 billion sitting in American banks, lending money to the American consumer. And we put our monetary deposits there at 0.5%. That means you're literally giving it away free. You can bring back $80-90 billion in tranches and add that and monetize it into the Indian system. There still you might get 5 lakh crores. Now everybody is taking a hit except government employees. Now we have 23 million government employees paid by the government. They are the highest wage cohort in the country. They account for 14% of GDP. Have they taken a hit? If you take away leave travel benefit, itself you will get 1 lakh crores. If you take a 10% salary reduction, you will get another 3-4 lakh crores out of it. But only one DA installment has been delayed. That means you'll have to pay the dues back later. Now, government employees are impervious to these kind of pressures and changes, and because our governments are afraid to take them on and say, look, you got to pay your price. Construction workers paying this price, the vegetable vendors paying this price, retailers are paying this price. Automobile Chennai is the center of the Detroit of India. How many people are jobless? There's no production. So your contract labor is out of the field completely. Now Maruti, for instance, has got 7,000 employees on its rolls and 30,000 contract laborers. Contract laborers are sitting out now because they get paid on a weekly basis through a contractor. So they're not even employees of the company. So we're looking at a disaster of monumental proportions. And we've got to see it as that. There's a human disaster, there's an economic disaster, and there's also a danger of a medical disaster hitting us. And you want to tackle all of them. You can't tackle them in compartments. You just can't say, I'm going to deal with COVID now, and we're going to lock down. We didn't consider for a moment the implications of a lockdown. You don't do a lockdown with 4 hours of notice. You have a large services establishment. We have armies of home guards. We have NCC. Nobody was deployed. We didn't have any field kitchens. And you expect people in Dharavi, people in Jafrabad, all who are locked, 8, 10, 20 to a room. And the average usage of a toilet It's 27 people to one toilet. How do you expect social distancing? And you expect them to sit inside their rooms and not move out when things are getting hot, when the climate is getting hot. And this electricity is intermittent. Landlords don't rested, they want their tenants to go. And people are going to be rested. That's why they're spilling out in the streets. You can handle that by suppressing the news for a while. But they're not going to be suppressed for long because it'll spill out. And it's already started coming out. You've seen videos of incidents in Rajkot, incidents in Bombay, incidents in Agra and Mathura and all these places. Once we have a breakdown of order, it might be very difficult for us to pull things back. While things are good, we should create hope in people. We should announce a real stimulus in the sense that, we'll say we can have. I remember in 1998 when I was in government, we had a similar kind of a situation when there was a slowdown. Prime Minister Vajpayee called a meeting and said, we've got to do something big. And he gave a mandate to think of some big employment generation and economy boosting schemes. And then next day, the group went back to him and said, let's build the national quadrilateral highway. So Vajpayee, made this big speech that I'm going to have a road from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and Somnath to Silchar. And that, of course, is economically not a good idea because you have to connect metros with highways. So then it became the golden quadrilateral. And that gave a boost because every mile of road highway will use so much of concrete and so much of steel. Every megawatt of electricity will use steel and cement for construction. So, it gives a boost to infrastructure. We've had no such boosts. We're only talking about it. So I think we have to be careful for the man-made disaster which is coming. It's not the first pandemic which has come to us from China. The 57 pandemic also came from Guangzhou. The H1N1 pandemics all came from China. And this one also well known is from Wuhan. So there is reason for us to be worried, the reason for us to wake up and do something, press our government, create public opinion through groups like this, which will, then in turn disseminate this information to others. So, I'll leave it at that and come back for discussions later, any questions. But I think, we also got to factor that GST collections are down. Government revenue collections are down. Import duties are down. Everything is down. So you've got to do something big. So think big now, not local, but think big.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohan. That's excellent overview. And I'll request the audience, you can actually start flagging the questions and so that we can take it on subsequently. Very important observations which you could, I'll raise the questions later. One is resource crunch and raising revenue is one issue. But if you print more money, then will that have its own impact is something Mohan can answer subsequently. While the US can continue to print any amount of money because the dollar is the universal currency, what happens to the other countries, particularly India, where our weakness in the economy is significantly different. Let me invite Vidya to cover the geopolitical and transformations, or is this the beginning of the end of the post-1945 world order? And is that going to change? And what is the impact for India and the rest of the world? Vidya, all yours.
I'm going to talk about the post-COVID-19 world and focus on geopolitics and the international order. And what I'm going to do is walk you first through what I see as the overall global context, talk about China's growing assertiveness, and then talk a little bit about the abdication of global leadership on the part of the United States, and then move on to issues of global governance, and especially talk about how these issues affect public health, global public health. So let me start with the overall context. And here, the primary international system change that is driving global geopolitical dynamics in the 21st century process of power transition between the is the 21st century process of power transition between the United States and China. And clearly, as you know, the United States is the dominant power and China is the rising power. And it's a fast rising peer competitor of the United States. Now, Russia, India, and the EU play an important role in this unfolding power transition in their respective regional theaters. And China plays a very important role in each of these regional theaters through its presence and its influence. So when you're looking then at the global context, the primary trend in geopolitics is the emerging Russia-China and India-US nexus. Escalating US-EU with Russia, US-EU-Russia tensions since the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea have had the effect of tightening the Russia-China alliance. Rising concerns in India over Chinese assertiveness and US concerns over China's global rise have cemented a closer India-US strategic partnership. The United States desires a unipolar world where it is the hegemon, and it would like to see a multipolar Asia where China faces significant challenges. China, on the other hand, desires a multipolar, better still a bipolar world, and a unipolar Asia where it plays a hegemonic role. So in this geopolitical power struggle between the United States and China, India's interests veer closer to those of the United States from a structural international systemic perspective than those of China. So what's happening during this protracted power transition process is that relations among major actors will remain fluid. Careful hedging will continue to be the primary strategy pursued by all powers. Calculated ambiguity is reflected, for instance, in India's omnidirectional policy of strategic engagement, which simultaneously seeks to promote a deeper partnership with the West, particularly with the United States, to sustain historically close ties with Russia, despite recent strains in that relationship, and to manage the complex and multifaceted India-China relationship. So that's the overall context. Let me move now to growing Chinese assertiveness. Deng Xiaoping's admonition to hide capabilities and bide time always had a sunset clause. The argument was that China had to wait until it was strong enough to project global power and influence. That time, according to Chinese leaders today, has arrived. Beijing's shift to a more assertive foreign policy came during Hu Jintao's leadership, when the 2008 global financial crisis showcased China's crucial role in spurring global growth. The 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing served as China's coming out party. On the heels of this heady sense of rising national power came President Xi's ambitious foreign policy agenda. Xi Jinping was simultaneously named General Secretary of the Communist Party and Chairman of the Central Military Commission in November 2012, and he was elected president by the National People's Congress in March 2013. By the time of the 19th Party Congress in 2017, Xi's consolidation of power over his party and the country was complete. The 19th Party Congress enshrined Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era and anointed him General Secretary for a second term. Very soon thereafter, in March 2018, the National People's Congress almost unanimously voted to abolish term limits for the presidency before electing Xi to a second presidential term. Xi's speech to the 2017 19th Party Congress showcased a confident China ready to take over as a global power in the shadow of US decline. She touted the Chinese path of development as a model for the world, positing China's blueprint as an alternative to the liberal democratic paradigm. In light of Chinese expectations of US decline, such statements demonstrate Beijing's objective of displacing the United States from its position of global dominance. China's growing foreign policy assertiveness is manifested in efforts that began in 2009 to militarize islands in the Spratly and Paracel archipelagos in the South China Sea, to claim sovereignty over a large swath of the South China Sea, encroaching with the 9-dash line on the EEZs, the exclusive economic zones of several countries in Southeast Asia, with which China has maritime territorial disputes. China declared an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, and it has challenged US freedom of navigation operations in both the South China Sea and the East China Sea. The People's Liberation Army has engaged in ongoing challenges along the undemarcated India-China border. Closer to home, Beijing has been aggressively pursuing its advantage, particularly in the post-COVID period, since the immediate threats in China have receded, vis-a-vis the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, and in escalating verbal salvos and military shows of force against Taiwanese independence, with recent omission of the term peaceful in connection with reunification rhetoric. China selectively supports global governance measures and a rule-based international order, as witnessed by Beijing's rejection of the ruling by the South China Sea Tribunal established through the Permanent Court of Arbitration under the Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it has made expansive claims of sovereignty rights over the South China Sea. Remarking on China's challenge to the international order, two scholars from the Lowy Institute in Australia have cautioned that the portrayal of China by the Chinese government as a governance model for other nations is especially worrisome, as it suggests a newfound willingness to offer an alternative to the Western liberal international order and directly confront the United States, which the Chinese leadership had previously eschewed. As articulated in the Party Congress work report, Xi's vision for the future may signal an intention to double down on challenging elements of the prevailing world order that Beijing sees as contrary to Chinese interests. Should this come to pass, the international community might look back at the 19th Party Congress as the moment when China's long march toward reclaiming its great power status was matched with confidence needed to present China as a buttress against Western liberalism. Beijing-led initiatives such as the Multilateral Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and Xi Jinping's Belt Road Initiative have raised questions in Western and Asian capitals about whether a Sino-centric world may portend a challenge to the multilateral economic and security order established by the United States in the post-World War II period. Let's move on then to a US abdication of global leadership. Now, this architecture that the United States had established after World War II is also being willfully undermined by the Trump administration. With the rising tide of insular nationalism captured in President Trump's America First slogan, the United States has unilaterally chosen to abdicate global leadership. This abdication is exemplified by US withdrawal from a whole slate of multilateral agreements, from the Paris Climate Accords to the Iran nuclear deal and the Open Skies Treaty, unarmed aerial surveillance flights over territories of member states. Hawks in the Trump administration have threatened US withdrawal from the World Trade Organization, whose appellate body has already been crippled due to the refusal by the United States to appoint new judges. The Trump administration has also cast China as a revisionist power and injected a high level of uncertainty and hostility in the relationship. So let's move to global governance. What happens when a rising power is trying to make claims to global leadership and the dominant power is retracting from this global leadership? As Mr. Mateshwaran had mentioned in his introduction, in an increasingly globalized world, states developed cooperative global governance mechanisms to fulfill the gap in addressing transnational challenges that are beyond the capacity of any state, even powerful states, to resolve on their own. Functional agencies of the United Nations offer examples of robust global governance. Thomas Weiss, a scholar who writes on global governance, has defined it as the sum of informal and formal ideas, values, rules, norms, procedures, practices, policies, and institutions that help all actors, whether they be state or non-state, to identify, understand, and address transboundary problems. Weiss also identifies 5 global governance gaps. And the reason I mention these is that they become very pertinent when we're talking about the global response to COVID-19. So the 5 global governance gaps he identifies are gaps in knowledge, in norms, in policies, in institutions, and in compliance. So the knowledge gap refers to the lack of consensus among states about the nature, causes, gravity, and magnitude of a global problem, and any global problem. With COVID-19, it's a global health, public health problem. And the knowledge gap offers then a serious challenge that the resolution of the challenge it poses to the resolution of the gap is that ideology can determine what information is made available and is acceptable. And it can even trump hard data. We see this, for instance, in the kinds of statistics, certainly in the United States, that states up each state within the United States is publishing on both the morbidity and the mortality rate associated with COVID-19. The normative gap arises when states fail to observe commonplace and expected rules governing behavior, but resist being singled out for egregiously flaunting international norms. So China, for instance, doesn't want to be singled out as the country that didn't take adequate measures initially to deal with COVID-19. The policy gap results from the contradiction between the need for effective global solutions to transboundary problems and the policy authority for tackling them that remains vested and nested in states. The institutional gap comes from multilateral institutions of global governance that lack authority and adequate resources. And the WHO is a good example of this, where the Trump administration has decided it's not going to contribute to the WHO. The compliance gap is a consequence of inadequate enforcement mechanisms that allow states routinely to flaunt international standards, almost always with impunity. So when it comes to public health, the premier global governance agency is the World Health Organization. And if we look at the governance gaps that I just listed, that Weiss has indicated, these governance gaps are manifested in the inadequacy of collective global efforts to mount an effective response to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. The WHO, the World Health Organization, was established in 1946 and charged with the responsibility for handling global health issues. So the World Health Organization is a global governance institution, and its headquarters are in Geneva, and it has 194 member states. Now, in 1999, the WHO published an influenza pandemic planning framework that emphasized the need to enhance influenza surveillance, speed vaccine production, and antiviral drugs. In 2003, the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network was formed by the WHO. and it provided a tip about an unusual clustered outbreak of respiratory illness in Guangdong, China, which Mr. Guruswamy had alluded to earlier. The World Health Organization in that instance called upon its network of influenza laboratories to identify influenza viruses that might have pandemic potential. And so between 2003 and the current pandemic, the World Health Organization has devised multiple formats and procedures to deal with pandemics. For instance, in 2005, it updated international health regulations focused on establishing and improving the global capacity to prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease threats such as pandemic influenza. And in 2011, the WHO introduced a pandemic influenza preparedness framework for the sharing of influenza viruses and access to vaccines and other benefits. So let's come now fast forward to COVID-19 and the challenge of global governance. The WHO China office reported the initial cluster in December of 2019, isolated the virus January 7, 2020, and then shared the genetic sequence of COVID-19 on January 12, 2020 to ensure proper diagnostic kit developments. But the WHO dragged its feet on alerting the world to the way in which human-to-human transmission had begun. So, appealing to the object and purpose of the international health regulations, the WHO, after the initial announcement of the identification of the virus, continued to remind countries of the need for proportionality in applying measures that are restricted to public health risks and which avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. And it was not until March 11th of 2020 that the WHO officially characterized COVID-19 as a pandemic. And it is this time gap that the Trump administration has alluded to in making the argument that China has been using the WHO for its own purposes. So US-China tensions have politicized the World Health Organization, with the Trump administration blaming both China and the WHO director for foot dragging and for minimizing the dangers of the global spread of COVID-19 in its early weeks. These geopolitical tensions have had the effect not only of impeding cooperative international measures to combat the spread of coronavirus and the COVID-19 disease that it causes, but also of exacerbating the 5 governance gaps to which I alluded earlier in knowledge, norms, policies, institutions, and compliance. Now, what has happened in the post-COVID period with China is that they have embarked on mask diplomacy, which is trying to rewrite the narrative to portray China as a global savior. And simultaneously, they have been practicing what has come to be called wolf warrior diplomacy, which is essentially rebuking foreign governments if they are not sufficiently grateful to China, public avowals of gratitude to China. On the US side, the US is considering multiple punitive measures against China because of the sense that China did not take adequate action to stop this pandemic. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions that Mr. Mateshwaran can moderate.
Thank you, Vidya. That's been excellent. And let me start with, let me start with my couple of questions. One is, of course, I've already mentioned that to Mohan, the issue of finding resources to actually address this in terms of revenue. And of course, can we print more money and what would happen and the impact on the economy? For Vidya, the other issue was the US-China tangle. The political leaderships in every country in a crisis tend to mask the inefficiency in handling the crisis by taking the narrative away towards politics of the day. And that tends to actually submerge the real issue of the problem. So in this particular case, the COVID-19, by targeting the China as being responsible for the spread of the virus, has the world, particularly the US, Australia, and have they deflected the real issue in terms of international cooperation that is vitally necessary and that needs to be addressed at the earliest to find a solution to the pandemic? That these two you can take on. Then what I will do is, there are questions here on the chat which I will read out. Each of the speakers can address that. Then we will open out to the audience and they can actually come in with their questions. Please, Mohan, you can take on.
Thank you, Matish. The first issue of, where is the money coming from? I've alluded to two sources which themselves will give you about 8 lakh crores. That is, get back some of your money sitting in foreign reserves, doing nothing for you, for your economy.
Absolutely.
That is one. The second, of course, is that, you put a cut on government employees, 5-10% cut. That will also amount to substantial. Take off additional benefits like leave travel, etc. That will give you some 1 lakh crores rupees there. Then the other thing is the banks are today flush with money. The top 10 corporates alone have 10 lakh crores as cash reserves. 10 lakh crores sitting in banks. So even if you sequester 10% of that and say we'll give you bonds against that, RBI bonds, guaranteed government bonds of 5%. So you're still talking about 1 lakh crores can be realized from just the top 10 companies of India. The total bank deposits in India are something like 85-90 lakh crores. Even if you take deposits over 10 lakhs rupees and say 5% of that you should invest in government bonds, you're still talking about a lot of money. You're in a problem, you need to have creative solutions. It's not just that the printing presses keep running. And every year we have deficit financing. The deficit target, no country has a rigid deficit target like we do. The United States has annual fiscal deficits of 7-8%. And at a pinch, you have 15-18%. Russia has, Japan has, Britain has. We are fixated on 3%. Why? Because, our thinking is dominated by merchant banking influences coming out of the Washington Consensus. And if you have a demand, then additional supply of money will get absorbed by the demand. Today you have a collapse of supply and a collapse of demand. You have to get out of it. If you try to work the conventional method of working out of it it'll take you 5-6 years to come back to where we were. The kind of hit we have taken. No country has had this hit, that 1/3 of its workforce gets jobless, 1/3 of this workforce without wages, 1/3 of this workforce looking at daily starvation. Nobody has this situation. So you got to respond to that. The other question, of course, is that, I'm not saying that you keep printing more money. There is money to be had. All you need is to get it out. Even today, banks are sitting with about 2.98 lakh crores money liquidity which they're not able to spend. Because people are not taking money from banks to invest in businesses. Where are you going to invest money? So if the government is confident of itself, it should now get into a big scale injection of funds to people who need it most and also to pump prime the economy. For instance, why don't we've got 3 months stockpile of automobiles, that's 7.5% of GDP. And why don't we say that for the next 6 months, GST rate will be half. So if you lift it now, you'll get stocks moving. Rather than this inertia. That, I remember in 1999, when a similar situation arose, the Vajpayee government said, okay, you will get depreciation for heavy vehicles for the complete year. So even if you buy it in March, you would get 12 months of depreciation. To move stocks, the revenue department will say there's a revenue loss. Where is the revenue loss when there's no revenue? When there's no sales? So you've got to incentivize movement of stocks. And that we haven't done. So there are so many, and I want to come back to one issue of China. For a start, don't believe that anybody unleashes the virus deliberately.
Absolutely. I mean, that's preposterous.
It jumps species every few. There's unmitigated disasters, even in industrial poultry, in industrial cattle, and pork. When viruses have no place to go, they'll jump species and come into human beings. This is an experience of history. But China's importance to the supply chain is now so important that Chinese went into lockdown in Wuhan in January. Entire automobile sector production in India got affected because alternators, fuel injection systems, etc., were coming from China. Certain critical components. Today, all our laptops, all our mobile phones come from China. 30% of our pharmaceutical raw materials. We keep talking about pharma, but the basic chemicals come from China.
We are dependent to the extent of 80% on the raw material.
Completely. We only keep thinking that we are importing plastic Ganeshas and manja. That's not true. We are importing a lot of stuff from China. And unless alternate supply chains are created, and that will take a long time. Will America start sourcing Apple iPhones from somewhere else?
No way.
It's aggregated in Chengdu. iPads all come from there. Where is the alternate supply? It's not question like shirts and leather goods and clothes and all moved out of China a long time ago. Shirts are Bangladesh is the shirt capital of the world.
That's right.
Every second shirt in the world is made in Bangladesh. Every third shoe in the world is made in Vietnam. Every third shoe is made in Indonesia. They've all gone. Soft toys, all this which employ labor, they've all gone. The Chinese have moved into a different economic cycle. They've gone into higher value addition, higher automation, and higher sophistication. For instance, today, if you don't get the components from China, you won't have flat screen TVs. That's why the Japanese keep inviting. They're China's biggest trade partners. The United States is a buyer, but trade partners, Japan and Korea and others are trade partners. There's exchange of goods constantly. We don't have that. We are very much like a mini US. We keep consuming from China. And we can't get off. Now, and we the government has said for years that firecrackers should not come from China. That holy colors should not come from China. But are we able to control it? The containers still arrive. And, the inspection doesn't take place, or you fix the inspection, and the goods are in the market. But this cutting off this China trade, again, the game we're playing. And I would rather see at this time with China struggling to park its, surpluses in other economies, to get the guys invested here in a bigger way, in infrastructure, in all kinds of things. And so that you get long-term investment, they're committed to you. But if you say no Chinese investment is possible now,
we are vulnerable.
What are you doing to yourself? Now, I think we should be very careful on, this talk of Quad is fine. Do you think Japan will come to our assistance if we get into a conflict with China? You think the US will come?
Absolutely.
And Australia, let's not take Australia seriously at all. There are more people in trains in India than in the whole of Australia. So Quad is a spurious idea that we should give traction to it here. Because in the end, we stand by ourselves. And we are the only ones with a land border, an undemarcated land border with China. And we both got almost 300,000 men facing each other, eyeball to eyeball, across the border. And we have to strategize on how do we deter them from doing that. You can't do that by matching man to man and gun to gun. You're going to semaphore differently. And like the Chinese say, talk, talk, fight, fight. The greatest lesson in history from China is they hate the Japanese the most in China. And Japanese hate Chinese. But they are biggest trading partners with each other. The Chinese happily sell to America. And they've turned US into a supplier of primary goods. Pork, beef, corn, very little value-added goods like aircraft, transport aircraft. But everywhere else, they've reduced the US to a supplier of primary goods. Just like they've reduced us to supplier of primary goods. Iron ore, this mineral, that mineral. But we don't do any value addition. I think we've got to be very careful. We've got to do this slowly and deliberately. You need a national strategy for the next 10 years. These are our goals. This is what we need to do. And take this COVID crisis as a challenge from which we will work ourselves way out, restructure our economy. And above all, we've got to keep an organized sector of 200 million people employed. You don't get them employed by transformation suddenly into becoming a big car exporter.
Yes.
Car exports are fine, but they won't employ people. How do you prevent people from starving? Our problems are totally different. No country in the world has our set of problems. And we can't look for Washington solutions and Beijing solutions here at all. There is to that extent, I agree with the Prime Minister. There is an Indian solution for the Indian problem. It's a unique problem. So I think we've got to go back to the drawing books now. This is the time. I think the Chinese, all use the word for crisis. Also reads for opportunity.
That's right.
I think we've got to take that seriously. If you have to learn so many things from China, it is that. The other lesson is you look at the way they do business with Japan and Korea. And they're not inventing the wheel again. They're doing, they are aggregators of iPhones. The iPhone, out of the $300 of export price, the Chinese get only $14 because they're a final aggregator. The glass comes from Taiwan, the IC comes from Malaysia. So we've got to learn also to aggregate. But we've got a problem with high and unproductive labor forces. I was once explaining this in China to an official in the Shanghai government. He laughed and suddenly said, "Mr. Guruswamy, you have too many communists in your country." So I think we've got to learn lessons from them and also not repeat their mistakes. For instance, yesterday government sanctioned 7 new coal-fired plants. We already operate the dirtiest coal generators. And we're going to add to that.
Pollution again.
And I think all of us have experienced good clean air in the last 3 months. What's one bonus which came out of this? And I think we shouldn't get back in a hurry to pollute our air with new coal-fired power plants.
Thanks, Mohan. I think very important observation. Vidya, your comments, and before we move on to the others' questions.
Sure.
Right.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Vidya, I'll come back to you. Yeah, Vidya, go ahead.
Okay, I'll be very quick and just say that both in the United States and China, the leaders have used mistakes they've made to rewrite the narrative and to rewrite the narrative in ways that deflect responsibility onto someone else. For instance, in China, Xi Jinping was nowhere to be seen. And part of the reason for the mistakes is systemic in China, is that local leaders were under tremendous pressure in Hubei province, and particularly in Wuhan, not to publicize this information. In fact, if you remember reading news reports, the doctor who first tried to warn other doctors through his social media was censured for it.
Mm.
And so, China now is trying to rewrite the narrative and trying to tell the story of how a one-party system is much more effective, or has been much more effective in addressing this pandemic than have democratic governments. And this has been a narrative that China has been pushing in the face of flailing democracies, whether you're looking at Italy or in Spain or in the United States, the UK. In the United States, after a period when we had enough warning to have introduced containment measures, we failed to do that. And so the administration now here is trying to deflect responsibility. And in many ways, if you look at the case of the United States, the experts are being muzzled. The guidelines that the CDC had put out, they had to scale them back in response to political pressure. And as the numbers of deaths have gone up, and the United States is on target to exceed 100,000 in a few days, the government is trying to deflect blame. And part of this is blaming the WHO, blaming China, and both China and the United States are trading insults and taking the kinds of actions that are just going to ramp up hostility and come in the way of cooperative measures that are necessary if one is to expect any kind of global leadership.
Thanks, Vidya. And I suppose, as Mohan said, also the lessons that come out is, whether it's developed countries or underdeveloped countries or developing countries, the pandemic has exposed the inadequacies of each of these governments in their ability to handle. And so much as China has behaved in a certain way, if it had started in the US or in any other country, those leaderships would have also probably behaved the same way. And that is something, people need to understand. Leadership don't want to understand that. Besides that, I think what Mohan pointed out actually flags the issue that the economic radical transformations will need a well thought out strategy, particularly for India, on a long-term strategy and continuous consistency approach. So let me actually now change the format slightly. While I'll read out the questions from the chats, let me also start with, I'll alternate between, the audience and the chats. So Vijay, you've come earlier, so you can start your question and to the speakers. You can address
Thank you. Can I just make a few quick comments? First of all, my comments are limited to India, and they're also limited to what we think in specific terms we should do in India. I mean, the global thing is fine. We can learn from it. We can expand on it. But I think our real crisis is, what do we do in India right now? We are on multiple crises, and I'd like to focus a little on that. One is, to shift the whole situation. It's one thing to keep talking about the economic package, but anyone who's ever been on the implementation side, are you aware that in a system that barely manages to spend the current the budget, its ability to spend that is limited. So we need to focus. It's like saying that I have a tank, double the size of the tank, and fill it with water, but the pipes are the same. So you need to double the size of the pipes. You need to focus on the pipes. You need to focus on new pipelines, and we're not focusing on that. That's really the key. The second part is, if you want all of this money to really pay off, I mean, as they said, in a pipe, if you wanted to deliver water, then one is the source, but you need to focus on where you're going to discharge the water that's coming out of it. And the problem is more complicated when there are multiple outlets at that pipe. Where should those pipes be? How much should go into that? I think there's much too little debate happening on all of that. So we can keep flying at 30,000 feet and, say, go to a 10% GDP and put more money in. The question is how, where, and when. And finally, if you want to get it in a country like India, identify the teams that will do it, monitor it, and make sure that they specifically follow up what they've been given. You've been in the Air Force. Tell me, for so many years, the Air Force budget, at the end of the day, your capital budget has still got 10,000, 15,000 crores sitting in the budget, unspent. That's the focus of the problem. Let's not worry about about saying give the Air Force 3 times more budget. See that they can get and pay for and do what they've already got and expand that. So the policy framework, identification of the specific guys who are going to do it, find leaders for each specific area. Very quickly, I'll just talk of 2 things that I know about that have been referred to. One is the automotive industry. Okay, I've been involved with Maruti and I know a little bit about the automotive industry. First of all, let's go pre-COVID-19 and look at the automobile market. The fact is that the world as a whole and India in particular has overexpanded capacity. So they were talking of India being able to reach 6 million automobiles a year by the next year or something, and that collapse had already started. So let's just take a simple practical thing. Let's assume that from our existing capacity of 4 million cars a year, we're going to go down to 2.5 or 3 million. We need to be focusing on how we'll readjust employment and everything else to cover that drop from 3 million or 4 million to half. The same applies to the airport. Take a simple case. Delhi, Bombay had 68 city pairs a day. That means there were 68 flights between Delhi and Bombay per day. Okay. We were doing 130, 140 million passengers. Let's be clear, even net of COVID, India is going to be down to, let us say, 80, 90, 100 million passengers. So we have specific problems. How are you going to adjust to that change? And we need to start working on that. And the point is, here we are starting to look at redeploying labor. That's really the real burden of my song. We need to be focusing on redeploying labor. We need to be focusing on identifying where they can go, retraining them. That's much more important than saying, are you going to give 20,000 crores to the airlines or not? They will manage that if you help them with all of the practical terms they're dealing with, redeploying labor, re-employing labor, all of that. That's key. So let's focus on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. Let me, before ask Mohan to respond to that, I will also add a question for Mohan here. This is from a student. The meantime, Kevin, welcome. He is from Philippines. Aditya is from waiting to join London School of Economics. She did the interns with us. Here's a question, interesting one. Central banks across developed countries such as Britain, Japan, and Germany have started borrowing at a negative interest rate, which is a first in banking history and goes against the norms of capitalism. How dangerous is this trend? What would be the far-reaching impacts of this policy? Yeah, Mohan?
First issue of redeploying labor. Labor is just not a widget. You move from one hole to another hole. You've got a problem, and I've said this explicitly several times today, that you've got a workforce of 210 million unskilled workers in the unorganized sector who are daily wage earners. You don't earn money, you go hungry. It's a humanitarian issue. And I'm not talking about giving government money, I'm talking about putting money in their general accounts. You can't allow people to starve. Today, rural India is now facing 30% unemployment. You got to ward off starvation. Second is, you can't reskill and redeploy workers just like that. That's going to take a huge shift in the economy, directions of the economy. How will you replace construction labor in the country? Unless you go for automation, which means you make labor redundant. They absorb 54 million people. You can't do anything. You can't do anything in the short term. It's all nice and tried to say that we're going to do this, we need new pipelines. But where is the metal to make pipes?
Can I just respond to that?
Let me just finish.
Okay.
You have to say. And therefore, first thing is to put food in the stomachs of people, to put money in their hands. There's not a shortage of food production. There's a shortage of buying capacity. Famines take place in India not because of not enough food production anymore. They take place because purchasing power collapses. We've got to attend to that problem as if it was done yesterday. And we haven't done anything on that. You talk of deficit financing, you've got the American world, there's more money flooding into the market, and therefore goods are going to become expensive. You have no production here. And automobile sector, you've got finished stocks now lying. If you're working in the automobile sector, you would know that there are huge accumulation of stocks. How do you move those stocks? There's a real problem there. So therefore, you need to give an incentive for people to go and buy those cars now. And the only incentive is that you get a huge price reduction. Now, a car, 38% of a car is in taxes. Give an incentive for a short-term period. So government revenues come in, and people take the stocks off the retailers. So I think there are lots of things to be done separately, differently, and we've got to think differently on this. Now, as far as negative interest rates are concerned, it's bound to happen if there's an oversupply. People are not spending so money and rolling into the banks. Japan has been giving negative rates in banks for a long time. You actually had to pay the banks 1% to keep your money there. Mm-hmm. And it's bound to happen. That's all telling you that your money has lost its use in large sections of our economies all over the world. Not so in India. But we still will see decrease in interest rates. Now in America, people are paying, oil companies, drilling companies are paying people money to take their oil. So there's a negative oil price of $7 a barrel, a ton. Because the wells can't stop just like that. They just keep pumping oil and you have no storage capacity. China has a reserve of 160 million tons. We have a reserve of only 30 million tons. No storage built up. I think lots of things have to be done at the same time. So therefore, you've got to go back to drawing board and work in New India.
Thank you. Mohan, any of the audience who wants to come up?
A quick question, may I?
Yeah, Pushi, please.
It's for Mohan Guruswamy, obviously. Mohan, there's a question lurking on everybody's minds, too afraid to ask, what's going to be the real-time and long-term effect of what's happening in India on the political governance of our country? I mean, we got millions on the move, nobody knows what's happening. Come on, Mohan, you can say it.
Yeah. One more question I'll take, Mohan and Vidya. Yeah, Kevin from Manila. Kevin?
Yes, Kevin, professor at the University of the Philippines. Hello, everyone, and I'm zooming in from Taiwan.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
Stranded in Taiwan?
Yes, I'm visiting professor now here at the in Chiayi, which is south of Taipei. Anyway, thank you very much to the foundation, and thank you very much to our speakers. All right, it's wonderful to be connected. Right. Anyhow, I 3 brief points, and my reflections are more towards thinking about where this crisis, in a way, I think ought to take us, right? And I shall echo, I think, what Mohan is trying to say here, right? Number one, all right? Vidya was talking about great powers, right? And I think what any crisis does is that it reveals or it exposes, right, weaknesses and strengths, okay? And what the crisis has done is that it's exposed the weakness of great powers. It's exposed the weakness of America no more than it has exposed the weakness of a rising power vis-a-vis a waning power. At the same time, it has revealed the strength of small countries, not to mention non-states, quote unquote, such as Taiwan, okay, Korea, okay, Singapore, and so on. They've become, Sweden, they've become interesting models, okay, for dealing with pandemics. And I think there's a lot to be said about this. Okay, I shan't go on because we've got a conversation going. That brings me to my next point, and that is what Vidya was saying. And has also been puzzling my mind somehow. And that the point here is that a certain sense of anachronism about international organizations in this day and age. I question, right, the effort and the money that we're putting in international organizations. All right. Okay. I've worked for the European Commission, right? It is sad what's going on, and I've also my work has been with ASEAN, right? So as a background, I see these two regional organizations from very different perspectives, and it has influenced the way I think about what an international organization should be now, at least. After 1945, because I feel the world is so different from 1945. So it's a kind of anachronism that I see. And again, the World Health Organization, you talk about this was what, December 20, and then it declares this on the 11th of March. So what did we really learn that we did not pick up directly, Vidya, from, if you wish, other countries not having to go through WHO. In fact, WHO was in a way a kind of a distraction, because we got sort of caught up in the politics of who and not really looking into wait, hang on. So like, we're here in the Philippines. What are we doing? What are the Taiwanese doing? We can actually use for the islands in the Philippines and so on. The third is, I think that global problems, at the end of the day, are global because they're local problems for everyone. If they're not local problems for everyone, they're not global. And the point that I'm trying to say here is I think I agree very much with Mohan and Mrs. Chang. He said, I think this is an opportunity to actually somehow restructure, rethink, right, the way that we are organizing political space. One question that I ask people here in Taiwan is, how do you really want to be a state? Right? Because once you become a state and once you become part of the international community, then you are accountable to international organizations which are under the hegemony of great powers. And I'm not sure how much a price you have to pay. That includes your freedom, independence, and so on, once you become a part of the international community, which in this day and age is somehow a kind of an illusion. All right. So I think COVID should wake us up to what you say, Mohan. When I think about the Philippines, because Taiwan here, is impressive. It's absolutely impressive, right? But when I think about the Philippines, right, and how, for example, some islands were far better managed or were not as affected as Manila, I begin to think about how social space ought to be restructured with a different kind of threat, for humanity survival. Okay.
Thank you, Kevin. That's wonderful.
Kerala showed the way in India.
I'll also add one more question for both of you. That's from Jayaka Vedamanikam. Would the world oil consumption rate likely to be reduced? If so, which countries are likely to reduce the production? Okay, Mohan and Vidya, a quick responses from both of you.
If I may respond to the professor from Taiwan, I think the notion that you propose is an interesting one, which is one of inverted devolution. That local leaders are best able to take care of problems that may be global in scope but have local effects. Now, in the case of Taiwan, I think you're exactly right The smaller countries that showed very effective leadership were Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, New Zealand, and Sweden. So
Norway.
the larger question is how applicable are these models to larger states? I think they're more applicable to disaggregated larger states. So for instance, how is San Diego dealing with it, or the larger Southern California area? But in Taiwan's case, the question I have in response is, to what extent is Taiwan going to be able to withstand the pressure from China for reunification? The constant the military exercises, missile tests, the pressures that China places on Taiwan. And then the other, and to connect it with what Mr. Guruswamy was saying, what is the economic relationship between Taiwan and China, and to what extent can China use its economic clout to undermine Taiwan's success? So while I don't, I agree with every point that you made, the 3 points, and spoke very much in favor of an anachronistic set of international organizations. The question I have is, would we be better off if these organizations did not exist at all? And I think that would be an interesting question to address. Would we be better off with no WHO, no Food and Agricultural Organization, no International Civil Aviation Agency? And once you get into the dynamics of that, you realize that perhaps we need to restructure them as opposed to throw them out entirely. And so that's a question I'd love to hear your response.
Yeah. You want Kevin's response on that?
Maybe in a while. I think you were going to get some.
Let Mohan answer, then probably Kevin can give that answer. Yeah, Mohan.
This question,
Politics.
I've had some experience with an international agency many, many years ago, just after I graduated from university. And I was always appalled by how little they do and for how much they cost. I think to become an international civil servant is, to be on a wonderful holiday. But having said that, there's an important function, of being a clearing house for information from all over the world. For instance, WHO doesn't undertake medical programs of its own. It just keeps countries informed of what the other one is doing.
It's
Therefore,
a clearinghouse.
To hold WHO responsible for it'll only pass on information which China gives you. The IMF only clears information which other countries give. If India says that we are growing, our GDP is growing at 10%, they will say report it at 10%. So, except for the World Bank and IMF, which are also multilateral institutions, most UNDP, UNESCO are all clearinghouses. I think some place where people can talk and exchange views. And some place for, where our well-connected civil servants can also be sent for postings. And, you come back, to come back to India on a UN pension is a wonderful thing. We've had many people at the top who get UN pensions, which is absolutely tax-free and beautiful. And then they end up doing good service in India. But so you can't do away with that. You need organizations like Civil Aviation Organization. You still got to coordinate world traffic standards, exchange information. They don't do any administration. For instance, for all practical purposes, the international aviation standards are administered by the US FAA. Like the pharma industry is effectively managed by the US FDA, because it's to their standards we make and to them we sell. Indian standards don't apply there. So this is some realities we take into account. But there is the WHO clears information, passes information, lets people know what's happening. And I think there's a limited service, but it's an essential service. And I don't think, we should deny some people a good standard of living just because, the output is not proportionate to the amount of money we spend on is very little. The US has been a big supporter, so they've had a claim to saying they want to create pocket organizations. The US gives WHO 400 million a year. China gives 40 million. So they say if you want you want to give China as much a voice as you're giving us, then you ask the Chinese for more money. I think it's a fair question. And I think you will see the organization of international agencies this way in the near future, or in the future anyway. Or maybe US will get a change in administration and you'll get somebody like Biden, who a big spender, who give money to the world. So, but like Kevin said, this is a time to go back to the drawing boards and replan our economy and how we are doing work to our strengths. And that is not going to be done easily. How long will it take us to come out of this hole we are in? I don't expect things to begin the uptick for another 18 to 20 months. And then to come back to those old growth rates, those heady growth rates of 8%, 9% might take us another 5, 6 years. We will limp along. So we've taken 2 mortal blows. Don't forget, demonetization was a mortal blow.
That's right.
And for no rhyme or reason, we only got 10,800 crores as as black money, so-called, in quotes. Because people who have black money don't invest it, keep gunny bags of it at home. You buy property, you buy gold, you take it abroad. Last year we exported $83 billion of illicit capital to America, to havens, to Singapore, Cyprus, Austria, Luxembourg. Very little actually goes to Switzerland. Who's our biggest foreign investor in India? Now it is Singapore, then Mauritius, and then Cyprus. It's all our money is recycling back. Ditto for China. The biggest overseas investor for them is Hong Kong. There's recycled money coming back. So I think, we have good chance to get back. I think we could do with a planning commission at this stage. But we've turned NITI organization into another DAVP to be a defender of the faith in public, which is unfortunate.
Anyway, okay. Yeah, okay. So I think, Kevin, you want to say something? Yeah.
All right. Vidya, thank you. You've raised extremely difficult questions. And so a disclaimer before I briefly answer your question. One is, I'm not an expert on Taiwan, and I'm just really discovering, much to my amazement, right, that this is a kind of a hidden gem, right? And I was, just living across the waters, right? Because I'm a Filipino Spanish. Now, I think that the series of questions in Taiwan deserve another Zoom rendezvous.
Yeah.
They deserve another Zoom meeting, all right? But let me focus what I think was the final question, which I have also asked myself, Vidya, which is, are we actually better off? And I think that's right on the spot, all right, and crucial. Are we better off without these organizations, without these international organizations? I shall take the radical position and say, I think we will be better off without them, right? I can somehow play it on the safe side and be, quote unquote, realistic. But I think it might actually be more practical if we did away with them completely. Okay, the way that the UN was very much plagued by the template of the League of Nations. Okay, now why am I saying this? Because so far, I think we have tried to somehow deal alongside these international organizations. And they have been what we call regimes, right? Functional regimes in the form of treaties, the international human rights regime, and so on, right? So in particular issue areas with varying degrees of scope, okay, in terms of the responsibilities that states exercise and take on when they participate in a regime, all right, whether it be climate, pollution, and so on. The problem, however, is that, I think what has underwritten this has been an idea of multilateralism, which is the liberal world order, an order which has been underwritten by America. And I think it was fantastic for a certain time. It worked. But if you also talk to the people in the State Department, I was doing my Fulbright in 2018 in Washington. The sense that I got when I spoke to them was that multilateralism was very good on paper. But at the end of the day, things worked, especially for America, on a bilateral basis.
That's true. Kevin, we are going to be running out of time. So,
I think that what can possibly be done is that if we have to work with states, Vidya, I think states have to take on what they are good at. They've got to take on projects, okay? And they can take on partners. So to be very specific, if we're really talking about Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, New Zealand, Sweden, what do we really have to think about World Health Organization, okay? Or can we actually break that down? If these countries have been excellent in dealing with a pandemic situation, can they not start a kind of a coalition or a core and become, a group that somehow, not a G8, say a G5 or a G6, but in terms of this particular global problem.
Thank you. Puneet, would you like to say anything? You have a question?
No, I really enjoyed being on this, Matthew. In fact, it's so good to hear various perspectives. And most importantly, I would say, rather than blaming, the word is not blaming, we're holding China and WHO accountable. And the other thing is, when President Obama confirmed the Paris Accord, he didn't have the support of the US Senate and the Congress. And Iran was a wrong deal, which Obama took us in. So that's few of these things, and I can get more into it, but it's really enjoyable. Thank you for having me. It's almost 2:10 in Eastern Standard Time. So, but I really enjoyed all the panels. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you. And here's one major question for both Vidya and Mohan is from one of our students. There has been some discussion lately surrounding India's potential to replace China as the global manufacturing hub, to encourage foreign investment and to shift production bases away from China. Economically and politically, do we see this as a realistic possibility? I personally feel it's quite a bit of a humbug, but Mohan and Vidya, you can throw light on this. Is this both practically, economically, and politically, is this really viable? And I don't think, people should get fooled by the kind of slogans and real statements that are coming around. Throw some light on this before we finish today.
I'm gonna cede to Mr. Guruswamy because I think his whole talk exactly explained why this is not easily feasible.
Mohan?
Yeah, I agree with you, Matish. This is a pipe dream and, a lot of hogwash at this moment, because India is a very inhospitable place for industry and investment. We have got too many rules, too many regulations, local government regulations, state government regulations, central government regulations, customs, banks, everything. You keep running up against the state everywhere. And then we have very militant trade union organizations.
That's true.
In our organized sector, And this makes life extremely difficult to function. As a result, people in India are setting up, for instance, why is the contract labor system big? Because you want to avoid employment. You can't, because once a guy comes onto your payroll, I've seen this. I was managing director of a large company for 5 years, making mechanical engineering goods, and 1,200 workforce. My biggest benefit to profitability came when I gave a VRS scheme, and I borrowed money from the IDB. I said that please think of this as capital investment and lend me money to pay off the workers. So we gave them 24 months salaries and said, please go. And then we started taking contract labor. The same workers came back as contract workers at half the salary and double the productivity. There are time and motion studies for this. Because once you go to union, the outsiders come in. And they're a good source of income for the political parties. The biggest trade unions today are with the political parties. The BJP has got the BMS, the Congress has got INTUC, the CPI has got ITUC, somebody has got SITU, somebody else has got something else. And so, they're very militant. As a result, you have a situation where Maruti Udyog typically pays a permanent worker something like 40,000 rupees a month. The contract worker doing the same work gets 8,000 rupees a month. Now, and then you have bonus, whether you make a profit or loss. The concept of bonus stands on its head in India, where there's a compulsory bonus, 8 1/3%. Like white collar workers, 5-day weeks. So productivity is low. Our cost of production in India is higher than China. So who's going to come here? So Bangladesh got 4 million people in the garment industry because they operate sweatshops. Can you operate a sweatshop in India legally? If you're an exporter particularly, can you operate a sweatshop? All you do is set up a sweatshop in Bangladesh. Do you know that we used to have the world's biggest clock-making industry in Rajkot? The entire clock-making industry in Shanghai, owned by Indians. And the clocks come made in China, the fans, ceiling fans, they're all coming from China now. We tried putting them into small sector, doing all kinds of things, and it didn't work. The Chinese fans are made in large factories, automated factories, and they're cheaper. So unless you say that, I'm not going to adhere to WTO rules to which you sign and have, system of tariff on finished goods, you're not going to protect your market and product. And so you need some of that. Therefore, you have to go back to drawing board at this time. Take the crisis as an opportunity and look at all these things.
Absolutely. I think that's the most important message, that we need a radical transformation of the economic structure and principles. But we also need to look at how the international system and what would happen to the Chinese strategies on BRI, the economic system transformation that are coming underway. I think we can, this is a huge topic and we can go on endlessly, but I think we're running out of time. We've come to the end of the session today. It remains for me to thank Mohan and Vidya for a wonderful exposition today and very, very interesting interactions. I must also thank the audience for a very active participation. And I think this session has been very useful to, particularly for the younger lot and some of our graduate students who are doing internships. And thanks, Kevin, thanks, Puneet, and all, Jeka, or all of them. Andre is here. Andre came in a little late, and welcome, Andre, but we'll catch up later. And it's remains for me to thank all of you for making this session extremely wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mohan. Thank you, Vidya. Please give them a big hand. That's right.